Captain Sarah Martinez had always known the sound of doubt. It followed her through the halls of Fort Rucker during flight school, whispered in the corners of briefing rooms, and echoed in the skeptical glances of her male colleagues. The year was 2003, and despite women having been officially allowed in combat aviation roles, the Apache helicopter community remained a brotherhood that seemed allergic to change. Sarah stood 5 feet 4 inches tall, with calloused hands from years of gripping joysticks and dark eyes that missed nothing. She had grown up in a small Texas town, where her father ran a crop-dusting business. By age 12, she was helping him maintain the old Cessna. And by 16, she was flying solo runs over cotton fields. The military had seemed like a natural progression, a chance to fly something with teeth. The Apache AH-64D longbow was a predator in every sense. Bristling with Hellfire missiles, a 30mm chain gun, and sensors that could spot a tank from miles away, it was designed to hunt and kill armored vehicles. The 2-seat tandem cockpit put the pilot in back and the gunner up front, both wearing helmets weighing nearly 5 pounds each, packed with targeting systems that turned their eyes into weapons. Sarah's journey to the Apache began with endless hours of simulator training. The aircraft was notoriously difficult to master, requiring pilots to think with both sides of their brain simultaneously. The left eye looked through a monocle display showing targeting information, while the right eye scanned the outside world. Most people's brains couldn't handle the split attention. Sarah's could. Her instructor, Chief Warrant Officer Mike Rodriguez, was a veteran of the Gulf War with over 2,000 flight hours in the Apache. He had trained dozens of pilots, but he had never trained a woman. The first time Sarah climbed into the cockpit, he made his position clear. "I've got nothing against women," he said, adjusting his headset. "But this bird weighs 17,000 pounds when loaded, carries enough firepower to level a city block, and moves at 165 miles per hour. 6 feet off the ground. It's not a place for anyone who can't handle the heat." Sarah simply nodded and began her pre-flight checklist. Over the following weeks, she proved herself in ways that surprised everyone, including Rodriguez. She could hover the massive machine in a 10-foot circle while engaging multiple targets. Her gunnery scores consistently ranked in the top 5%. She memorized every system, every emergency procedure, every tactical manual they threw at her. But scores on paper meant little to the old guard. Colonel James Harrison commanded the 1st Battalion, 1st Aviation Regiment, and he had fought in Vietnam, flying Cobras before transitioning to Apaches. He believed in tradition, brotherhood, and the idea that some jobs were simply meant for men. When Sarah's training commander recommended her for combat deployment, Harrison was less than enthusiastic. "She might be a good pilot," Harrison told Major Williams, the battalion operations officer. "But can she handle the pressure when someone's shooting back? Can her wingman trust her when the situation goes sideways?" These aren't questions we need to be asking when lives are on the line. The deployment orders came in March 2003, as Operation Iraqi Freedom began its violent opening act. Sarah's unit, Alpha Company, was assigned to support the 3rd Infantry Division's push toward Baghdad. The mission was simple in concept, but brutal in execution. Clear Iraqi armored units from the path of the advancing American ground forces. The first few weeks of deployment tested everyone. Sarah flew 17 missions in the first month, mostly reconnaissance and close air support for infantry units engaged with irregular forces. She performed flawlessly. But these weren't the tank-killing missions that Apaches were built for. The Iraqi Republican Guard's armored divisions had pulled back toward Baghdad, and satellite intelligence suggested they were massing for a major counteroffensive. Sarah's co-pilot was Lieutenant Danny Chen, a fresh-faced gunner from California who had graduated flight school just 6 months before deployment. Chen was eager, technically proficient, and young enough to lack the preconceived notions about women in combat that plagued some of the older aviators. He trusted Sarah's flying and rarely questioned her tactical decisions. The tension came to a head during a mission briefing in early April. Intelligence reported a Republican Guard tank battalion moving south from Baghdad, consisting of nearly 50 T-72 and T-55 main battle tanks. The mission was to intercept and destroy this armored column before it could reach American ground units, advancing through the desert. Colonel Harrison assigned the mission to his most experienced crews. Captain Jake Morrison, a pilot with 4 years of Apache experience, would lead the flight. Captain Bill Jackson, another veteran, would fly as his wingman. Sarah was assigned to the third aircraft in the formation. Martinez, Harrison said after the formal briefing ended, "You'll be flying trail position. Stay back, observe, and only engage if the lead elements need assistance." Sarah felt the familiar burn of frustration in her chest, but she kept her expression neutral. "Yes, sir." Trail position. Morrison approached her after Harrison left. He was a good pilot and a decent man, but even he seemed uncertain about having a woman in the formation. "Look, Sarah, I know you can fly, but this is different from anything we've done. If things get complicated, just stay high and keep your head on a swivel. All right?" Sarah nodded, but inside, she was seething. She had trained for exactly this type of mission. Her gunnery scores were better than Morrison's. Her tactical knowledge was as extensive as anyone's in the unit. But because she was a woman, she was relegated to watching from the sidelines, while the men handled the real fighting. The morning of the mission dawned clear and hot. The 3 Apaches lifted off from their forward operating base at 0600 hours, flying low across the desert landscape. The terrain was mostly flat, with occasional wadis and rocky outcroppings that provided concealment. Sarah's aircraft, call sign Demon 3, flew approximately 2 kilometers behind the lead elements. The flight north toward the reported enemy position took 40 minutes. Radio chatter was minimal, with Morrison providing periodic updates to their operations center. Chen, in the front seat, continuously scanned with the aircraft's targeting system, looking for any sign of enemy movement. At 0645 hours, Morrison's voice crackled over the radio. "Demon flight, this is lead. I've got visual on the target area, multiple vehicles in defensive positions, beginning approach." Sarah watched through her targeting system as Morrison and Jackson began their attack run. The Iraqi tanks were positioned in a defensive line along a ridge, their main guns pointed south toward the expected American advance. It was a textbook tank-killing mission, exactly the scenario they had trained for hundreds of times. Morrison's first Hellfire missile struck a T-72 inches, the center of the formation, the explosion sending a pillar of black smoke into the morning sky. Jackson followed immediately, his missile finding another tank on the western flank. The Iraqi crews responded quickly, training their guns skyward and filling the air with anti-aircraft fire. What happened next would be debated and analyzed for years. Morrison's Apache, diving low to avoid a surface-to-air missile, clipped a communications tower that hadn't appeared on their maps. The rotor blades disintegrated in a shower of sparks and twisted metal. The aircraft hit the ground hard, rolled twice, and came to rest in a burning heap. Jackson immediately broke off his attack run to assist, but his aircraft took multiple hits from small arms fire. Hydraulic fluid sprayed from his tail boom, and warning lights illuminated his cockpit. "Demon lead is down," Jackson transmitted, his voice tight with stress. "I'm taking heavy fire and losing hydraulic pressure. Need immediate assistance." Sarah didn't wait for orders. She pushed her Apache into a steep dive, accelerating toward the enemy position. Chen, understanding her intent without discussion, began locking onto targets with their targeting system. "Demon 3. Maintain your position," Harrison's voice cut through the radio static from the operations center. "Do not engage without authorization." Sarah keyed her radio but didn't respond. She was committed now, her aircraft screaming toward the Iraqi position at 140 miles per hour, 30 feet above the sand. The enemy had shifted their attention to Jackson's crippled aircraft, giving her the element of surprise she needed. Her first missile launch caught the Iraqis completely off guard. The Hellfire struck a command tank, and secondary explosions rippled through ammunition stored in nearby vehicles. Chen was already locked onto a second target before the first explosion had faded. "Multiple launches," Chen called out, his voice steady despite the chaos around them. 11 o'clock, 2 missiles in flight. Sarah pulled the Apache into a violent right turn, deploying chaff and flares to confuse incoming missiles. The aircraft shuddered as shrapnel from a near miss peppered the fuselage, but the main systems remained operational. For the next 20 minutes, Sarah and Chen fought alone against nearly 50 enemy tanks and armored vehicles. They used every tactic in the Apache playbook. High-speed passes to avoid return fire, terrain masking to break enemy target locks, and precision gunnery that conserved ammunition while maximizing damage. Sarah's flying during this engagement would later be described as supernatural by military analysts who reviewed the gun camera footage. She kept the Apache moving constantly, never presenting a stable target, while Chen systematically destroyed enemy vehicles with surgical precision. The Iraqi return fire was intense and largely ineffective. Tank main guns, designed to engage ground targets, couldn't track fast enough to keep up with Sarah's maneuvering. Small arms fire rattled against the Apache's armored cockpit, but the aircraft was designed to survive such punishment. By 0720 hours, the enemy formation was in complete disarray. Burning vehicles dotted the landscape, and surviving Iraqi crews were abandoning their tanks and fleeing on foot. Sarah had exhausted her missile load and was down to her last few hundred rounds of 30mm ammunition. Jackson managed to nurse his damaged aircraft back to base, but Morrison and his co-pilot weren't as fortunate. Rescue teams later found both crew members dead in the wreckage, victims of the initial crash rather than enemy fire. Sarah landed her Apache back at base with bullet holes in the fuselage, a cracked windscreen, and empty weapons pylons. As she shut down the engines and removed her helmet, she could see a crowd gathering around her aircraft. Fellow pilots, maintenance crews, and senior officers were all staring at the battle-damaged machine that had just returned from an impossible mission. Colonel Harrison was among the first to reach her aircraft. His face was unreadable as Sarah climbed down from the cockpit, her flight suit soaked with sweat and her hands still shaking from adrenaline. "Martinez," Harrison said quietly. "My office. 10 minutes." Sarah nodded, knowing that her career could go either direction from this moment. She had disobeyed orders by engaging without authorization. She had also just completed the most successful single-aircraft tank-killing mission in Apache history. The aftermath of the mission would test everything Sarah had worked for, and everything the military claimed to believe about merit and performance. In a world where results spoke louder than prejudice, she had delivered results beyond anyone's expectations. The question now was whether that would be enough to change hearts and minds that had been closed for decades. Colonel Harrison's office was a study in military efficiency. Maps covered every wall, showing unit positions across Iraq, enemy threat assessments, and logistics networks that kept the war machine running. Sarah sat in a metal chair facing his desk, still wearing her sweat-stained flight suit, while Harrison reviewed the initial battle damage assessment reports. 47 confirmed vehicle kills, Harrison said without looking up. 16 T-72 main battle tanks, 23 T-55 tanks, 6 BMP armored personnel carriers, and 2 command vehicles. 1 Apache helicopter and crew lost, 1 damaged but recoverable. He finally raised his eyes to meet hers. Lieutenant Chen's gun camera recorded the entire engagement. "I've been flying combat missions for 28 years, Martinez, and I've never seen anything like what you did out there." Sarah remained silent, unsure whether she was about to be court-martialed or commended. In her experience, extraordinary results often came with extraordinary consequences. Harrison leaned back in his chair. "You disobeyed direct orders. I told you to maintain position and not engage without authorization. A formal investigation will determine whether disciplinary action is warranted." He paused, studying her face. "But before we get to that, I need to understand what happened out there. Walk me through your decision-making process." For the next hour, Sarah recounted every detail of the engagement. She explained her tactical choices, her ammunition management, and the split-second decisions that had turned a potential disaster into a devastating victory. Harrison listened without interruption, occasionally making notes on a legal pad. When Morrison went down, Sarah concluded, Jackson was taking heavy fire and losing systems. If I had waited for authorization, I'm descrime, he would have been shot down too. We would have lost 2 aircraft and 4 crew members instead of 1 aircraft and 2 crew members. Harrison nodded slowly. The results speak for themselves. But the Army doesn't function on individual initiative, Captain. We follow orders and chain of command for good reasons. Yes, sir. I understand that. Do you? Harrison's voice carried a challenge. Because from where I sit, it looks like you've been waiting for an opportunity to prove something. To show all of us that a woman can do this job just as well as any man. Sarah felt anger flare in her chest, but she kept her voice level. Sir, with respect, I wasn't thinking about gender when I made the decision to engage. I was thinking about saving Jackson's life and completing the mission. Maybe. Or maybe you saw a chance to become famous. The first woman to achieve a significant tank kill record. The papers back home would love that story. The accusation hit harder than Sarah had expected. She had always prided herself on being motivated by professionalism rather than personal glory. The suggestion that she had risked lives for headlines felt like a betrayal of everything she stood for. Colonel, I've never sought publicity or special recognition. I just want to do my job, and do it well. Harrison studied her for a long moment, then reached into his desk drawer and pulled out a folder. These are preliminary reports from the intelligence analysts who reviewed your engagement. They're calling it the most tactically perfect Apache mission they've ever analyzed. Your ammunition efficiency was 96%. Your maneuvering prevented the enemy from achieving a single effective hit. You neutralized an entire battalion-sized armored formation with one aircraft. He slid several photographs across the desk. They were reconnaissance images of the battlefield taken hours after the engagement. Burned and destroyed vehicles were scattered across the landscape like broken toys. This is what remains of the Republican Guard's 17th Tank Battalion. They were considered one of Iraq's elite armored units. Sarah looked at the images without emotion. Each destroyed vehicle had represented a potential threat to American ground forces. The mathematics of warfare were simple. Better to destroy enemy equipment from a distance than to fight them up close where American soldiers could be killed. The question, Harrison continued, is what we do with you now. This engagement is going to attract attention from higher headquarters. The media will eventually get hold of the story. The Pentagon will want to know how one female Apache pilot managed to accomplish something that usually requires an entire company of aircraft. Over the following days, the ripple effects of Sarah's mission spread throughout the military chain of command. The initial reports made their way to division headquarters, then to Corps, and finally to the Pentagon itself. The numbers were too impressive to ignore, and the tactical implications were significant for future Apache employment. Major General Patricia Hayes, the highest-ranking woman in Army aviation, flew to Iraq specifically to meet with Sarah. Hayes had fought her own battles against gender discrimination during the 1,980 seconds and 1,990 seconds, eventually rising to command positions that had never been held by women. Captain Martinez, Hayes said during their private meeting, you've put us all in an interesting position. Your mission was tactically brilliant and strategically important. But it's also going to be used as either proof that women belong in combat aviation or evidence that we're willing to take unnecessary risks for political reasons. Sarah found herself frustrated by the constant focus on her gender. Ma'am, I'm just trying to be a good soldier and a good pilot. I don't understand why that has to be about being a woman. Hayes smiled grimly. Because like it or not, you're not just representing yourself out here. Every mission you fly, every decision you make, is being watched by people who want to see you fail. They're looking for any excuse to say that women don't have what it takes for this job. The conversation was interrupted by an aide who informed them that reporters from several major news organizations were requesting interviews about the female Apache pilot who destroyed an entire tank battalion. The story had somehow leaked, despite military attempts to keep operational details classified. Hayes shook her head. And there it is. The thing I was worried about has already happened. Within 48 hours, Sarah's story was front-page news in major newspapers across the United States. The headlines varied but carried similar themes. Female pilot destroys 47 enemy tanks in solo mission, and Apache Angel, woman warrior devastates Iraqi tank battalion. The coverage was generally positive, but Sarah hated every word of it. The media attention created unexpected problems within her own unit. Some of her fellow pilots resented the spotlight being placed on their operations. Others questioned whether the story was being exaggerated for propaganda purposes. The brotherhood that had slowly begun accepting Sarah as a competent pilot suddenly felt threatened by her newfound fame. Captain Morrison had been posthumously awarded the Distinguished Flying Cross for his sacrifice during the mission. His funeral was held at Arlington National Cemetery, attended by his family and fellow aviators. Sarah was asked to speak at the ceremony, representing the survivors of the engagement. Standing at the podium, looking out at Morrison's widow and children, Sarah felt the weight of command decisions for the first time. Morrison had died because he had volunteered to lead a dangerous mission. His family was left to grieve because men like him chose to serve in places where death was always possible. Jake Morrison was everything we want in a combat pilot, Sarah said, her voice carrying across the cemetery. He was skilled, courageous, and completely dedicated to the mission and his fellow soldiers. The success of our operation was built on the foundation of his leadership and sacrifice. None of us will forget what he gave for this country. After the ceremony, Morrison's widow approached Sarah. Linda Morrison was a small woman with prematurely gray hair and eyes that had seen too much sadness. "I want you to know," Linda said quietly, "that Jake spoke about you before he deployed. He said you were one of the best pilots he'd ever seen. He would have been proud of what you accomplished out there." The conversation left Sarah with mixed emotions. She was honored by Morrison's professional respect, but she couldn't shake the feeling that his death had somehow been necessary for her to prove herself. The thought troubled her during quiet moments, when she had time to reflect on the mission and its consequences. Meanwhile, the Iraqi Republican Guard was not sitting idle. Intelligence reports indicated that they were reorganizing their remaining armored units and planning a major counteroffensive. The target appeared to be American supply lines that stretched from Kuwait to the advancing combat units near Baghdad. Sarah's unit was tasked with providing aviation support for a convoy security mission. 300 vehicles, carrying ammunition, fuel, and replacement parts would be moving through an area known to contain Republican Guard units. The convoy was vital to maintaining the pace of the American advance, but it was also an attractive target for enemy forces looking to strike back. The mission briefing took place at 0400 hours, with Colonel Harrison providing the tactical overview. Intelligence suggests the enemy has positioned anti-aircraft systems along the route. We're looking at possible SA-7 and SA-14 surface-to-air missiles, plus concentrated anti-aircraft artillery. This isn't going to be like the last mission where you caught them by surprise. Sarah studied the route maps, noting choke points where the convoy would be most vulnerable. The road passed through several urban areas where enemy forces could position themselves in buildings, making detection and engagement extremely difficult. "Sir," she asked, "what's our rules of engagement for urban areas? If we take fire from buildings with potential civilian presence?" Harrison looked uncomfortable with the question. "Minimal collateral damage. Positive identification required before engagement. But if American lives are at stake, you're authorized to defend the convoy with all necessary force." The mission parameters were challenging. Sarah would be flying as part of a 4-aircraft formation, providing reconnaissance and fire support for the convoy as it moved north. The route would take 8 hours to complete, requiring aerial refueling and crew rotation to maintain coverage. As Sarah conducted her pre-flight inspection, she noticed several modifications that had been made to her aircraft since the previous mission. Additional armor plating had been installed around the cockpit, and the aircraft carried an expanded suite of defensive countermeasures. Someone had also painted a small scorpion emblem near her name on the fuselage, along with 47 small tank silhouettes representing her confirmed kills. Chen joined her for the inspection, carrying his flight gear and looking more confident than he had during their first combat mission together. The shared experience of surviving an intense engagement had bonded them as a crew, and Sarah trusted his judgment completely. "Word is that the Iraqis have been studying our tactics," Chen said as they completed their inspection. "They know what happened to their tank battalion, and they're not going to make the same mistakes." Sarah nodded. "Good. It was getting boring shooting at people who didn't know how to fight back." The comment was meant to be humorous, but it reflected a truth that Sarah was still processing. Combat had proven to be both more terrible and more addictive than she had expected. The adrenaline rush of successful engagements was unlike anything she had experienced, but the human cost was always present in the background. The convoy departed at dawn, with Sarah's Apache providing overwatch from an altitude of 500 feet. The initial phase of the mission proceeded without incident, but as they approached the first urban area, her targeting system began detecting the electronic signatures of enemy radar systems. "Multiple threats," Chen called out. "I'm seeing search radars and what looks like fire control systems. They're trying to get a lock on us." Sarah immediately began evasive maneuvers, varying their altitude and airspeed to prevent enemy systems from achieving a stable track. The other Apaches in the formation spread out to avoid presenting a concentrated target. The attack, when it came, was more sophisticated than anything Sarah had previously encountered. Instead of the crude anti-aircraft fire of their previous engagement, the enemy had positioned mobile surface-to-air missile systems in prepared positions throughout the urban area. Multiple missile launches lit up the morning sky as Sarah pushed her Apache into a steep dive, deploying every defensive countermeasure the aircraft carried. The convoy below came under simultaneous attack from rocket-propelled grenades and small arms fire, turning the peaceful roadway into a battlefield. This would be the test that determined whether Sarah's previous success had been luck or skill, and whether she could perform under the most challenging conditions the enemy could create. The surface-to-air missile streaked past Sarah's cockpit so close that she could see the flames from its rocket motor. She yanked the Apache into a violent left turn, pulling nearly 4 Gs as she dove toward the city streets below. Chen was already working the countermeasures, filling the air with chaff and flares designed to confuse incoming missiles. "Demon flight, this is 3, Sarah transmitted, her voice steady despite the chaos around them. "Multiple SAM launches from the urban area. Convoy is taking heavy fire from prepared positions. Below them, the American convoy had ground to a halt as rocket-propelled grenades and machine gun fire poured from buildings on both sides of the road. Trucks were already burning, and Sarah could see soldiers taking cover behind their vehicles, returning fire at muzzle flashes in windows and rooftops. The enemy had learned from the previous engagement. Instead of presenting themselves as easy targets in open terrain, they had positioned their forces in a complex urban environment where civilian casualties were a constant concern and escape routes were plentiful. "Demon lead to all aircraft," came the voice of Captain Reynolds, who had assumed command of the flight after Morrison's death. "We need to clear those firing positions, but watch for civilians. I'm seeing movement in multiple buildings that could be non-combatants." Sarah studied the urban landscape through her targeting system. The city was a maze of 2- and 3-story buildings, narrow alleys, and flat rooftops that provided perfect concealment for anti-aircraft weapons. The Republican Guard had turned the entire area into a carefully planned kill zone. A second missile launch flashed from a rooftop to her right. This time, Sarah was ready. She dropped the Apache to street level, using the buildings themselves as cover while Chen acquired the launch position with their targeting system. "Target acquired," Chen announced. "Rooftop position, 2 blocks northeast of the convoy. I'm seeing multiple personnel and what looks like a missile reload team." Sarah maneuvered the Apache between buildings, flying barely 50 feet above the street. Pedestrians scattered as the massive helicopter thundered overhead, its rotor wash shattering windows and sending debris flying through the air. The Hellfire missile launch was perfect. Chen's target designation had pinpointed the exact building where the missile team was operating. The explosion collapsed an entire section of the rooftop, eliminating the threat and sending a clear message to other enemy positions. But the victory was short-lived. Anti-aircraft artillery opened up from multiple positions throughout the city, filling the air with explosive shells and tracer rounds. The other 3 Apaches in the formation were taking heavy fire, and one had already reported hydraulic damage. "This is Demon 2, came a strained voice over the radio. "I'm losing hydraulic pressure and have multiple warning lights. Need to break contact and return to base." Sarah watched as Demon 2, trailing hydraulic fluid, climbed away from the urban area and headed south toward their base. That left 3 aircraft to protect a convoy that stretched for nearly 2 miles through hostile territory. The tactical situation was becoming desperate. The convoy couldn't move forward while under fire, but staying in the kill zone meant certain destruction. American soldiers were pinned down and taking casualties, while enemy forces had the advantage of prepared positions and intimate knowledge of the terrain. Sarah made a decision that would later be studied in military academies around the world. Instead of continuing to react to enemy fire, she decided to take the initiative and systematically clear every potential firing position in the urban area. Demon Flight, this is 3, she transmitted. I'm going to sweep the city from north to south, building by building. I need you to provide overwatch and engage any targets that reveal themselves when I draw their fire. Reynolds hesitated. The plan was aggressive to the point of recklessness. A single Apache flying at low level through an urban environment filled with anti-aircraft weapons was essentially a suicide mission. Demon 3, negative. Too much risk for minimal gain. We need to maintain formation integrity. Demon 3, 2 formation integrity. Sarah was already diving toward the northern edge of the city, her mind calculating angles of attack and escape routes. Demon Lead. The convoy is taking casualties. If we don't suppress these firing positions, they're all going to die down there. Chen understood her plan without further explanation. As they approached the first group of buildings, he began systematically scanning for targets, while Sarah flew a predetermined pattern designed to draw enemy fire and expose hidden positions. The enemy response was immediate and overwhelming. Muzzle flashes erupted from windows, rooftops, and alleyways as every concealed position opened fire on the lone Apache. Sarah flew through the storm of bullets and rocket-propelled grenades, weaving between buildings while Chen methodically destroyed each revealed target. The 30mm chain gun beneath the Apache's nose fired in controlled bursts, each one precisely aimed at a specific threat. Windows exploded, rooftops collapsed, and entire sections of buildings crumbled under the devastating fire. Within 10 minutes, Sarah and Chen had silenced nearly a dozen enemy positions, but the urban fighting was taking its toll on their aircraft. Warning lights flashed on Sarah's instrument panel as fragments from exploding shells damaged various systems. The Apache's armor was designed to withstand small arms fire, but the concentrated anti-aircraft barrage was pushing the aircraft beyond its design limits. Multiple hits, Chen reported, his voice tense. We're losing fuel pressure in the auxiliary tank, and I'm seeing fluctuations in the electrical system. Sarah checked her fuel gauge and calculated their remaining flight time. They had enough fuel to reach base, but continuing the urban sweep would leave them with dangerously low reserves. The smart tactical decision would be to withdraw and allow other aircraft to continue the mission. Instead, Sarah pushed deeper into the city, hunting for the command and control elements that were coordinating the enemy attack. Intelligence reports had suggested that a Republican Guard colonel was personally directing the ambush from a command post somewhere in the urban area. She found it in a 3-story building near the center of the city. Chen's thermal imaging system detected the heat signatures of multiple personnel and electronic equipment that indicated a communications center. Radio antennas on the roof confirmed that this was the nerve center of the enemy operation. High-value target, Chen announced. Multiple personnel, communications equipment, and what looks like a senior leadership element. The building was surrounded by other structures, making a missile attack extremely difficult without causing massive collateral damage. Sarah would need to get close enough to use the chain gun with surgical precision, placing accurate fire only on the specific floors being used by enemy forces. She approached the building from the east, flying between apartment buildings and office structures at an altitude of less than 30 feet. Residents watched from windows as the Apache thundered past, its weapons systems trained on the command building. The enemy knew what was coming. Anti-aircraft fire erupted from every direction as Sarah positioned her aircraft for the attack. Chen waited until they were in perfect position, then triggered a sustained burst from the 30mm gun that shattered the entire 3rd floor of the command building. The effect was immediate. Radio traffic between enemy positions ceased, and the coordinated fire against the convoy became sporadic and disorganized. Sarah had successfully decapitated the enemy command structure, breaking their ability to conduct effective operations. But the mission was far from over. Her aircraft was now critically low on fuel and had sustained significant battle damage. Warning lights indicated failures in multiple systems, and the flight controls were becoming increasingly difficult to manage. Demon 3. You need to break contact and return to base. Reynolds transmitted, his voice urgent. Your aircraft is trailing smoke, and you're leaking fluids. Sarah checked her instruments and realized that Reynolds was right. The Apache was dying around her, systems failing one by one as battle damage took its toll. She had perhaps 15 minutes of flight time remaining before the aircraft became unflyable. The convoy below was finally able to move forward, with enemy resistance reduced to scattered small arms fire. American soldiers who had been pinned down for hours were advancing through the city, clearing buildings and securing the route for the vehicles behind them. Sarah began her withdrawal from the urban area, climbing slowly to conserve fuel and reduce the stress on damaged systems. The other two Apaches formed up on her flanks, ready to provide assistance if her aircraft suffered a catastrophic failure. The flight back to base became a race against time and mechanical failure. Sarah nursed the Apache through the sky, constantly adjusting her flight path to compensate for control problems and fuel leaks. Chen monitored the instruments, calling out warnings as various systems approached critical limits. Hydraulic pressure dropping rapidly, Chen reported. If we lose the remaining system, we'll have manual controls only. Manual flight controls in an Apache were barely adequate for basic maneuvering. Landing with manual controls was possible but extremely dangerous, especially with an aircraft that had sustained combat damage. Sarah could see their base in the distance when the final hydraulic system failed. The flight controls became stiff and unresponsive, requiring tremendous physical strength to manipulate. The aircraft wanted to roll to the left due to combat damage, and Sarah had to fight constantly to maintain level flight. The emergency landing was witnessed by hundreds of personnel at the base. Sarah brought the crippled Apache down in a barely controlled descent, the aircraft hitting the runway hard and bouncing twice before finally settling. Emergency crews were already racing toward them as the rotor blades wound down and smoke poured from damaged systems. Sarah and Chen climbed from the cockpit to find Colonel Harrison waiting beside the aircraft. His expression was unreadable as he surveyed the battle damage. Bullet holes perforated the fuselage. Sections of armor plating had been blown away, and hydraulic fluid pooled beneath the aircraft. Jesus Christ, Martinez, Harrison said quietly. How the hell are you still alive? Sarah looked back at her Apache, seeing it clearly for the first time since landing. The aircraft looked like it had flown through a hurricane of metal and explosives. By any reasonable measure, she and Chen should have been killed during the urban fighting. Good training and better luck, sir. Harrison shook his head. This goes way beyond luck. I've never seen flying like that. Ever. The mission debriefing lasted for hours. Intelligence officers, tactical analysts, and senior commanders wanted to understand every detail of the urban engagement. The gun camera footage was reviewed frame by frame, with particular attention to Sarah's low-level maneuvering between buildings and her surgical destruction of enemy positions. The final tally was impressive even by Apache standards. Sarah and Chen had destroyed 23 enemy positions, eliminated the command structure coordinating the ambush, and saved an American convoy that was vital to the continued advance toward Baghdad. But more importantly, Sarah had proven something that went beyond simple statistics. She had demonstrated that gender was irrelevant when measured against skill, courage, and dedication to mission accomplishment. Her fellow pilots, who had once questioned her presence in their ranks, now spoke of her with the same respect accorded to the most legendary combat aviators. Colonel Harrison's final report to higher headquarters was brief but decisive. Captain Martinez has proven herself to be one of the finest combat pilots I have ever commanded. Her performance under fire has been exceptional, and her tactical instincts are superior to officers with far more experience. I recommend her for immediate promotion and assignment to advanced tactical positions. The recommendation was approved within weeks. Sarah was promoted to major and assigned as the operations officer for a newly formed Apache squadron. Her responsibilities included training other pilots in the urban warfare tactics she had pioneered during her combat deployments. The media attention gradually faded, but Sarah's influence on military aviation continued to grow. Young women entering flight training now had a concrete example of what was possible in combat aviation. The barriers that had seemed insurmountable just a few years earlier were falling as more female pilots proved themselves in combat. Years later, when asked about her experiences, Sarah would reflect on the irony of her situation. She had entered combat aviation, simply wanting to fly and serve her country. The gender battles had been forced upon her by others who couldn't see past her physical appearance to recognize her professional capabilities. "I never set out to be a pioneer," she would tell audiences at military conferences. "I just wanted to be the best pilot I could be. The fact that I'm a woman was secondary to everything else. It shouldn't matter what gender you are if you can do the job better than anyone else." Oh, the Apache helicopter that Sarah flew during her final combat mission was eventually retired from service and placed on display at the Army Aviation Museum. A small plaque near the aircraft tells the story of its last pilot and the missions that changed military aviation forever. The plaque reads, "This aircraft was flown by Major Sarah Martinez during Operation Iraqi Freedom. In a single engagement, Major Martinez destroyed 47 enemy armored vehicles, establishing a record for Apache helicopter operations that remains unbroken. Her courage and skill opened doors for future generations of military aviators." Sarah Martinez had proven that excellence has no gender, and that courage is measured in actions rather than appearances. Her story became legend not because she was a woman who succeeded in a man's world, but because she was a warrior who excelled when her country needed her most. The doubters who had claimed that no woman could command an Apache helicopter had been proven wrong in the most decisive way possible. Sarah hadn't just commanded her aircraft, she had used it to rewrite the rules of aerial warfare and inspire a generation of aviators who would follow in her contrails.